C.J. Mahaney, in a marvelous message to us, really more than a message, it was an experience, wasn't it? It was an event. But he rehearsed to us that great doctrine which Jonathan Edwards so mastered in his own thinking. And Jonathan Edwards, like John Bunyan, would never have allowed his conscience to rob him of the purity of his understanding of justification. He would never have allowed his conscience to ultimately and finally condemn him. But neither would Jonathan Edwards ignore his conscience. In fact, it strikes me that when he made these resolutions, he wasn't talking to another person. He wasn't making a promise to men. Frankly, that would have been far more than any man would have expected. 70 resolutions? Nobody would have held him to that standard. Nobody would have expected him to articulate all of that. And on the other hand, he didn't make those promises to God either. He knew better than that. That's stepping into the danger zone. That's why I said I could never be a promise keeper. If they start an organization for promise breakers, I'll join. I'm not about to make pledges to God that I can't keep. That's pretty dangerous. Jonathan Edwards made 70 resolutions, are you ready for this, to himself. He made pledges to his own heart, to his own soul, because he understood the severity of the battle of sanctification. And he knew where it had to be won. And it wasn't going to be one outside of him, it was going to be one inside of him. Why 70 resolutions? I mean, I used to go to camp when I was a kid and they'd say, read the Bible for 15 minutes a day, like that was some spiritual triumph. You know, try to get your act together. Spend a little time with God, like this was really the great maximum commitment that was required. 70 resolutions. And maybe if you were dumb and somewhat shallow and trivial and not particularly gifted or devout, you might need 70. But, as we heard last night, if you're the most gifted who ever lived and the most godly who ever lived, maybe one would work, wouldn't it? Or two? 70? What do you think he knew? They called him to 70 resolutions. And what do you think he knew about himself that he made promises to himself, 70 of them, and determined and kept the pledge that he would recite them to himself every week of his life and at the end of every month and at the end of every year? What was he doing? I mean, to be really honest, some of you can barely get your flip-flops on and make it to the Saturday night service. And you wonder why you don't have any spiritual victory? What did Jonathan Edwards know? You'd think if you're that profound and that gifted and that godly, it might be a little easier. I'll tell you what he knew. He knew the severity of the battle going on in his own soul for his own sanctification. And he knew that he was his own worst, fill in the blank, enemy. It was in that imaginary Orwellian year of 1984. And there was a flight. It was a flight of Avianca Airlines. A jet. It crashed in Spain. Flew, as far as we could tell, straight into a mountain. And of course, investigators studied the accident site, recovered the proverbial black box, and they made an eerie discovery. The black box from the wreckage of that Boeing aircraft had contained in it a voice recorder which revealed the several minutes before the fatal impact. And the first thing that the investigators heard was a shrill, sort of computer-synthesized voice from the plane's automatic warning system, and it told the crew in English, they were a Spanish crew, it told the crew in English, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up. And then, astoundingly, the voice of the pilot was heard, snapping back, "Shut up, gringo." And he switched the system off. In a matter of minutes, the plane smashed into the side of a mountain and everybody was instantly killed. As I read about that a number of years ago in connection with a book I was writing on the vanishing conscience, it struck me that that is in some ways a parable of the way modern people treat the warning system that God's put in their souls. God has given us some very, very gracious gifts. And one of them is conscience. And we hear about it. There are little phrases, guilty conscience, etc., that we often perhaps use or hear used. But I think the conscience is one of the least understood gifts that God has granted to us, one of the least understood areas of biblical teaching, and I want to draw your attention to it. Maybe to give you a parallel is a good place to begin. You also have another system in your body. It's called pain. It's very helpful. It is very helpful. It's a warning system. It's exactly what it is, and it's designed to tell you that something is wrong with you physically. And if you just continue to override that pain, you will do permanent damage to yourself. One of the most interesting diseases that I've ever read about is leprosy. I mean, I like you, grew up as a little kid hearing all about lepers, in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and how Jesus healed the lepers. And I remember hearing that lepers were people who had no ears and no noses and no chins and no fingers and no toes and sometimes no feet, and the hands were nubs, and that leprosy eats away the perimeter of your body. I found out a lot later by doing some reading on it that leprosy doesn't eat anything. Leprosy is a nervous disease, a nervous system disease. It destroys your nerves, so you can't feel anything. So you rub off your nose, and you rub away your chin, and you rub off your ears, and you rub off your fingers and toes because you cannot feel, you cannot sensitize the level of pressure, the degree of pressure that's being applied, and you literally start erasing yourself. You can thank the Lord that you can feel pain. That's a gift that God has given us to warn us when we are doing damage to our bodies. And conscience, like that, is the same kind of warning system that God has given to us to tell us when we're doing damage to our souls, when we're doing damage to the spiritual part of us. Look at Romans chapter 2 for a moment, and I'm going to give you a long introduction and a very short message, whatever that might be worth. May not be worth much. But just so you know, we're working up to something. In Romans chapter 2, it says, the Gentiles, verse 14, who do not have the law, do instinctively the things in the law. These not having the law are law to themselves, verse 15, in that they show the work of the law written in their hearts. And I want to get to this part. Their conscience bearing witness. The conscience is a witness, and it has two functions. It either, according to that verse, in their thoughts, accuses or excuses. It either indicts you or it defends you. It either says this is good for you or this is bad for you. It is the most important warning system because it's dealing not with the outside, but with the inside. To do anything to make conscience function less than perfectly is to engage in soul-destroying activity. The wisdom of our day wants to render the conscience ineffective. The enemy, the god of this age, who develops the system that surrounds us in the world, wants us to ignore conscience and misinform conscience. Conscience may be saying, pull up, pull up, pull up, while the culture is saying, shut up, gringo, and turning off the switch. It may be contemporary modern psychology that says man is basically good, and to have a guilty conscience is to fail to recognize the necessity you have for feeling good about yourself and having self-esteem. It may be just a reversal of all moral values. It may be the idea that guilt is toxic or whatever. But we live in a society that's trying to do two things, and I just want you to think about these two things. One, misinform conscience, and two, shut it off. There were two things happening in that airplane. One thing that was happening was radar was finding a mountain, right? Radar was sending out a bounce-back signal that was informing that warning system that there was a mountain. Radar was articulating reality. And then there was the responding warning system that told the pilot what to do in face of that reality. Only two things needed to happen to save the lives of those people. One, you had to know what was reality, and secondly, you had to accept the warning. Sanctification functions on those same two principles. Starts with knowing the truth. Your conscience has to be fully informed about the truth in order to properly warn you. False information telling you to pull up confuses everything. I'll give you an illustration. A couple of weeks ago, I happened to be on Larry King Live, and I know some of you seen me on there. It's always really interesting, and what's interesting is what you don't see. What happens in between, between Deepak and me, and which is really kind of funny. Deepak is a pantheist who is convinced that God is in all of us, but mostly in him. And what makes it so interesting is he's very short, and it's hard to be short when you're God, and a lot of people who aren't God are really tall. But anyway, we have some interesting talks. Well, anyway, we were talking, and Dennis Prager was there. You know who Dennis Prager is? A Jewish commentator, and we're talking about convictions and religion. This was in between airtime. And Dennis Prager said to Larry King, well, what kind of a Jew are you? He said, well, I'm an agnostic, secular Jew. He said, well, so you're not a religious Jew? No, I'm not a religious Jew at all. I'm a secular Jew. But he said, I'll tell you this. I was raised in a very kosher Jewish family. And to this day, now this is Larry King, and he's in his 60s, and he's gone through 7 wives and a whole world of experience. But from my childhood, he said this: if you gave me milk and meat in the same meal, I'd vomit. Wow. What would make him vomit? Because from the time he was a little kid, he was informed that violated the law of God. And that has so stuck in his mind that it triggers his conscience and makes him sick. That's encouraging to me. If he's still got that sensitive a conscience, if we could just get it the right information, they could function. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he said, if you go to a non-believer's house, a non-believer, a Gentile non-believer, invites you over, okay? For dinner. He's a non-believer. You're going to go on a little evangelistic deal. You go to his house. And you bring along a weaker brother, right? You bring along a new believer who's just been saved, let's say, out of idolatry. And you go to this guy's house and... to his own conscience in all those resolutions when he went over them again and again and again. Didn't need a crowd. He didn't need somebody there. He didn't tape record it to be publicly broadcast. It wasn't even prayer. Are you ready for that? You don't find Dear God in there, do you, Steve? You might find Dear Jonathan. The conscience is the soul reflecting on itself. It is at the core of what distinguishes human beings from animals. No ape ever made a resolution. This is what it is to be self-conscious, self-aware, reflecting on ourselves. It is our own innate ability to understand what is right and what is wrong and to make determinations to do what is right and not what is wrong. When the conscience functions as it should, when it's violated, it produces shame, regret, guilt, fear, anxiety, disgrace, anguish, and sometimes even depression. Now, conventional wisdom would say, you better go see a counselor. I'm afraid some people in the evangelical world would say, if you have shame, regret, guilt, fear, anxiety, disgrace, anguish, and depression, you better go see a Christian counselor. You can't allow yourself to be indicted like that. I mean, even if Isaiah in chapter 6 showed up and said, I'm a man of unclean lips. Somebody might say to him, you need some counsel. You need some help. You got to think better of yourself. You're the best guy going. You speak, God speaks. You're really not to blame. You got toxic parents, as one writer said. Or you ate too many Twinkies and it's having this effect on you. Or you took a pill, that's why you killed your grandparents, right? There's going to be a quasi-medical or psychological explanation for everything, but this does damage to sensibilities. And it's tantamount to saying to your conscience, shut up, gringo, flipping the switch. In fact, you can get so good at it, Paul says in Philippians 3:19, that with some people, this is really amazing, their glory is in their shame. Boy, now you know that thing is not functioning at all. Their glory is in their shame. Look at the MTV generation. What are they proud about? How base can you get? You think that's new? Go back and read Isaiah 5, where they substitute good for bad and bitter for sweet. The mind and the conscience, Titus 1:15 says, can become totally defiled. When that happens, there's really no way back. And I've often thought, too, that you can even sit in a place and hear preaching and teaching, and the same sun that melts the wax hardens the clay. If you keep listening and keep listening and keep listening and keep denying the role that your conscience plays, you're going to get very good at becoming hard. Jonathan Edwards knew that. And the way he continually cleaned his conscience was to go back through the 70 resolutions. That was like... measure yet of human wrong left the unbalanced scale, great Nemesis, thou didst call the furies from the abyss and bid them howl and hiss. Now, what does our society want to do with that kind of stuff? Shut up, gringo. Leave me alone. The conscience has a bully function. And it can be most relentless and it can be most disturbing. It is the enemy of the sinning soul. It is also the truest friend of the righteous soul. I'm going to tell you something, young people. You can talk about accountability till you're blue in the face, till you're purple, till you're out of breath. You can talk about who are you accountable. I'm going to tell you this right now. You will never know truly sanctified life until you win the battle where no one in the world can hold you accountable except God himself, and that's right inside your own heart. Jonathan Edwards knew that. We see this. Pastors accountable to congregations and boards and friends and wives and children morally crash into a mountain and explode. And sometimes people will say, well, maybe they didn't have accountability, or who was ministering to them. And I'm not saying there's no place for that. I'm just saying that's not where the battle is fought. The real battle for your spirituality, I'll tell you this, your conscience fights all by itself. And time and truth go hand in hand. Given enough time, if you're losing it inside, it'll show up outside. Very few men's sins follow them after, though some do. Most find that their sins discover them while they're still here. Well, let's get a little more specific. Let me define conscience for you. It is the soul's warning system. It is the gift of God. It plays a critical role in salvation and sanctification. It senses moral violation when rightly informed and says, pull up, or you're going to crash. Now listen. Conscience is part of you. Okay? And that means it's not perfect. It's not infallible. That's right. That's why Paul said, you remember in 1 Corinthians, he said, it's a small thing, chapter 4, what men say about me. It's a small thing, what you say about me. And then he went on to say, even when I know nothing against myself, herein am I not justified. I'm not even an accurate judge of myself. I can't even fully count on my conscience as being infallible. I will say this, the clearer it is, and the more well-informed it is with the truth, the more it will do what God has designed it to do. Still, even though the conscience has felt the curse, when it is informed accurately by the Word of God, and when it is cleaned by repentance, and when it is maintained by the Holy Spirit, is still able to say, pull up, pull up, pull up. And to reject the voice of your conscience, if you're now doing things in your life, secret, private things in your life that are going against your conscience, the future is going to be far worse than the present, because you will become skilled at silencing your conscience. It's still, while you're young, critical that you feel the full anguish, shame, anxiety, fear, regret, disgrace, doubt, depression, the absence of joy. You need to feel the fullness of that. God help you if you're past that and you're only 20. This is what Charles Wesley understood. Listen to what he wrote. This is a hymn I'm sure you've never sung. But he wrote this hymn. This is it. Listen. I want a principle within. I want, he said, a principle within of watchful godly fear, a sensibility of sin, a pain to feel it near. He said, help me the first approach to feel of pride or wrong desire, to catch the wandering of my will and quench the kindling fire. And he wrote another verse. From thee that I no more may stray, no more thy goodness grieve. Grant me the grace, I pray, the tender conscience give. Quick as the apple of an eye, O God, my conscience make. Awake my soul when sin is nigh, and keep it still awake. He knew what he was talking about, didn't he? I mean, he was dealing with the real deal. It's pretty common for people in my life to say to me, you know, John, please don't fail. Please don't desert your wife or run off with the church money, or please don't. And I appreciate that. And I encourage people, if you knew my wife, you would know that I would never leave her. She is the greatest adventure I've ever been engaged in my entire life. And every day is a greater joy than the day before. That there's still this fear, and people will say, well, you know, we're praying for you that this wouldn't happen. And I know in my own heart, and no one else knows, whether that could happen or not, whether I'm on that path or not. You know, when disaster comes, it's not the beginning of anything. It's the end of a long process of ignoring your conscience,